They said a man who leaves the teams never really comes home. He just learns how to breathe in quieter places. When the mountains outside Bozeman swallowed Ethan Cross into their biting silence, people figured he'd fade out like smoke from a dying fire. But he didn't. He survived because of a wounded German shepherd he found half buried in snow, shivering in a steel snare like the world had signed its name on his pain. Ethan cut him free, fed him his last strip of jerky, and talked to him the way lonely men talk to the dark, honest, rough and trembling around the edges. He thought he was just saving a stray. He had no idea that by saving that dog he was stepping onto a battlefield nobody warned him about, because that wasn't just a dog, and those weren't just headlights crawling up the mountain road. When the matte black SUVs rolled to a stop outside his cabin, Ethan realized the snow wasn't the only thing hunting tonight. And if you want to see what happens when a Navy SEAL and his loyal K-9 refuse to bow to evil when a simple rescue turns into a war for truth hit, subscribe right now and join this pack. Don't watch this story alone. Subscribe because the next chapter might be the miracle you didn't know you needed. The wind off the Bridger Mountains carried a hard metallic cold, and the pine forest outside Bozeman, Montana sounded like it was whispering old warnings into the snow. Ethan Cross 35 moved through that silence the way he used to move through hostile streets overseas, quiet, measured, never wasting a step. He was American-born, broad-shouldered and lean from years of disciplined training, with a weathered jawline that held a short, tidy stubble and a faint scar that cut near the corner of his mouth like a sentence that never got finished. His hair was dark brown, kept close on the sides, practical, the kind of haircut that didn't ask questions. His eyes were a steady gray blue that looked calm until you got close enough to notice how often they checked reflections, corners, distance, like the world had taught him that peace was just a different kind of ambush. He wasn't wearing a uniform anymore, but he still dressed like a man who didn't trust luck. A worn olive field jacket, insulated gloves, heavy boots, and a small pack with medical tape, a multi-tool, and a flashlight. Some people left the Navy SEALs and tried to become normal. Ethan left and became quieter, as if he could outwait the memories if he sat still long enough. He had come to the edge of the forest because the city noise made his thoughts echo too loudly. Out here the cold was honest. It hurt, but it didn't lie. The cabin he rented was a modest thing. Cedar boards, one small porch, a wood stove that clicked and sighed like an old man. It was temporary, he told himself. Just a season. Just until he stopped flinching at slammed doors, until he stopped waking up with his hands already searching for gear that wasn't there. But he'd been repeating just a season for months, and the winter kept answering. Then prove it. That morning, Ethan was doing what he called his perimeter check, though no one had hired him to guard anything. He told himself it was for safety, bear tracks, broken fences, illegal snares. The truth was uglier and simpler. Checking the perimeter gave his mind a task, and tasks were bridges over dark water. When he found the first sign, thin steel cable half buried in snow, his stomach tightened with anger, not because it threatened him, because it threatened anything that couldn't write a report after being hurt. He followed the cable line into a drift, and the forest revealed its secret with a sound that was not quite a bark and not quite a whine. It was the sound of pain trying to be brave. Ethan dropped to a knee, brushed snow away, and saw the dog. A German shepherd male about 3 years old enough to have strength, young enough to still believe in moving forward. His coat was a classic black and tan pattern, but dulled by mud and frost with clumps of ice caught in the longer fur along his chest and tail. One ear had a torn notch, the kind that told a story Ethan didn't want to hear. The dog's ribs showed faintly beneath the fur, not from starvation alone, but from weeks of hard living. His amber brown eyes were bright and furious, fixed on Ethan with the kind of mistrust earned, not imagined. The steel cable was cinched around his rear leg, biting into flesh, and the dog's body trembled with the strain of not yelping too loudly. Predator instinct, survival instinct, pride. Ethan exhaled slowly through his nose the way he used to before cutting a wire he couldn't afford to get wrong. "Hey," he said, gentle but firm, as if speaking to a skittish teammate instead of a wounded animal. "I'm not your problem." The dog bared his teeth, a flash of white, a warning that said, "Come closer, and I'll make you regret it." Ethan respected that. In his world, courage often looked like aggression when fear had nowhere else to go. He took off one glove, let the cold bite his fingers, and held his empty hand out in the air, not close enough to touch, just close enough to offer a choice. "You can hate me later," he murmured, "but you need to live first." He reached into his pack and pulled out a strip of jerky, his lunch, and tossed it into the snow a few feet away. The dog's nostrils flared. Hunger and distrust fought a brief war in his face. Finally, he snapped the jerky up, chewing fast eyes, never leaving Ethan's. Ethan's mouth twitched almost a smile. "Good," he whispered. "Stay with me." He moved with a controlled patience, talking the whole time in a low voice, not because the dog understood English, but because Ethan understood silence. Silence could turn into panic if you let it. He braced the dog's leg with one hand, careful to avoid the cable bite, and used the multi-tool with the other. The steel clamp was rusted stubborn like it enjoyed being cruel. Ethan's jaw tightened. He thought of men who set traps like this and called it sport. He thought of the way his chest sometimes felt hollow like a room after everyone leaves. He didn't want the dog to become another empty room. The clamp finally gave with a sharp metallic click. The dog jerked, then froze as if unsure whether freedom was a trick. Ethan wrapped a bandage around the raw wound, then added layers of tape to keep it from freezing. The dog's breathing slowed, still shallow, still guarded. Ethan looked into those amber eyes and felt something shift inside him, an old instinct waking up, the protective one, the one he'd tried to bury under quiet routines and locked doors. "All right," he said, voice rougher now. "We're not doing heroic speeches. We're doing logistics." He slid his jacket off and laid it in the snow like a makeshift blanket. The dog hesitated, then allowed Ethan to lift him heavy, solid, all muscle under exhaustion. The dog didn't relax, but he didn't bite. That was trust in its smallest, most sacred form, permission. Ethan carried him back toward the cabin, each step crunching like punctuation in the snow. Halfway there, the dog's head sagged against Ethan's shoulder for one brief second, and Ethan's throat tightened as if the cold had found a new place to cut. He realized he was talking again. "You're safe," he kept saying like a prayer he didn't fully believe yet. At the porch, Ethan paused, looking at the dark line of trees. He had the uncomfortable feeling they were being watched, not by the dog, not by wildlife, but by something else, something with patience and plans. He told himself it was paranoia. Then the dog lifted his head and stared into the forest, rigid as a statue, ears angled toward a sound Ethan couldn't hear. "You feel it too," Ethan whispered. The dog blinked once, slow, and Ethan made a choice that felt like fate wearing work boots. Ranger Ethan said, naming him without ceremony, "If you're going to haunt my cabin, at least do it with a proper call sign." Ranger's eyes narrowed, almost offended, and Ethan gave a dry, broken laugh that surprised him with how human it sounded. He opened the cabin door and carried Ranger inside, unaware that somewhere beyond the mountains, men who liked matte black vehicles and quiet threats would eventually start following the trail of that injured German shepherd, because some assets weren't meant to disappear, and some rescues were the spark that lit a war. Snow kept falling in slow, indifferent sheets, but the cabin felt less like shelter and more like a checkpoint once Ethan Cross carried Ranger over the threshold. The wood stove threw a dull orange glow across the floorboards, and the air smelled of pine resin smoke, and the sharp antiseptic bite of the medical wipes Ethan tore open with his teeth. He laid the German shepherd on a folded blanket near the fire, careful with the injured rear leg. Ranger male, about 3 years old, heavy-boned and muscular under the grime, didn't whine again. He watched Ethan with eyes that had learned the cost of weakness. Ethan recognized that look too well. It was the same look he'd seen in young teammates the first time a mission went sideways. "You're not dying on my watch," Ethan muttered, half promise, half command, as he cleaned the torn skin and checked the swelling. Ranger's breath came out in foggy bursts, and when Ethan pressed near the wound, the dog's lips lifted in a silent snarl, more reflex than threat. Ethan didn't flinch. He spoke anyway, like he could talk the pain into obedience. "I get it," he said softly. "You don't trust hands. Neither do I." The truth sat behind his ribs like a stone. Trust had gotten people killed. Trust had gotten Ethan out alive, and then left him alone with the echoes. He taped the bandage down, then gently splinted the leg with a thin strip of cedar, and more tape, improvising the way he always had. Ranger's ears flicked at the sound of the tape ripping. His gaze tracked every movement as if recording Ethan's pattern, memorizing who in the room had power. Ethan poured a small bowl of warm water, then set it down and backed away. Ranger didn't touch it until Ethan looked away, like dignity demanded the illusion of choice. That made Ethan's mouth twitch again, a humorless, almost smile. "Stubborn," he whispered. "Good. Stubborn lives. He forced himself to eat a few bites of jerky more for discipline than hunger. The more he watched Ranger, the more the feeling from the forest returned, that tight prickle along the back of the neck that SEAL training had branded into his nerves. Ethan walked to the window and peered through frost-laced glass. Only trees, snow, and the black ribs of the mountains. Nothing moved, and that was what bothered him. In war, stillness was rarely peace. Sometimes it was the pause before impact. Ranger shifted, then sat up with effort as if he refused to be helpless even on a blanket. He stared at the same tree line Ethan had been watching. The dog's posture wasn't fear, it was recognition. Ethan didn't like that. He didn't like the idea that Ranger's past had teeth. The next sound didn't come from the forest. It came from the road, far off, faint like a rumor at first. A low crunch. Tires. Ethan froze, counting seconds the way he used to count heartbeats in the dark. No one drove up here in winter, unless they had a reason. The crunch grew louder. Ranger's hackles lifted. His chest vibrated with a warning growl that made the stove's metal door rattle. Ethan moved without thinking, grabbing his coat, his flashlight, and the old hunting rifle he kept more as a deterrent than a plan. He didn't chamber around yet. He didn't need to. The sound was wrong. Not the sputter of a local truck, not the casual slide of someone lost. This was steady, controlled. Ethan killed the cabin light, leaving only the fire's dim glow, and took position at the window's edge. Through the glass, he saw them, 3 matte black SUVs easing into the clearing like predators that had learned to wear silence. Reinforced bumpers, tinted windows, vehicles built to take hits and keep moving. Ethan's stomach tightened. Ranger's growl deepened, then stopped, entirely replaced by a tense stillness that felt like a leash pulled too tight. Doors opened in near unison. 4 men stepped out, and even from the cabin, Ethan could read them, posture-squared movements. Economical, the kind of coordination that didn't come from weekend hunting trips. The leader approached first. He was in his late 30s, tall and thick through the shoulders, with a sharp, angular face and a close-cropped black beard that framed a mouth trained into polite menace. His skin was pale from winter, but his eyes were warm brown, too. Warm, too practiced, the eyes of a man who had learned how to smile while lying. He wore a dark soft-shell jacket and combat pants, gloves, and boots, clean enough to insult the mud. Ethan watched him scan the clearing, then the cabin, then the tree line, as if mapping escape routes. The man lifted his hand and knocked once, friendly and firm. "Evening," he called, voice amplified for calm. "Sorry to bother you, we're looking for a dog." Ethan didn't answer. He listened. Another man circled left, stockier blonde hair, shaved close, a hard jaw with no beard, eyes like flat steel. A third stayed near the SUV, average height but wide through the chest, with a baseball cap pulled low and a restless energy in his stance like he didn't enjoy waiting. The fourth remained by the driver's door, quiet, watchful face partially hidden by a scarf. These weren't hunters. Hunters smelled like wood smoke and impatience. These men smelled like procedure. The leader spoke again as if addressing a customer service call. "German Shepherd, male, injured leg. If you've seen him, we can pay. We're his recovery team." Ranger's head snapped toward the door. Not fear. Anger. The dog's lips pulled back, teeth flashing in the firelight. Ethan felt something protective rise in him, something older than logic. "Recovery team," Ethan murmured under his breath, tasting the words like poison. He stepped closer to Ranger and laid a hand on the dog's shoulder. Ranger trembled, not from pain, but from the urge to launch. Ethan's palm was steady. "Easy," he whispered. "Stay." He opened the inner latch but kept the chain on, cracking the door just enough to speak without offering the room. Cold air knifed in. The leader smiled wider when he saw Ethan, as if relieved to find a person instead of a problem. "Sir," the man said, "name's Cole Mercer." His voice was smooth, rehearsed. "We're trying to retrieve our working dog. He's valuable and we've got paperwork." Ethan studied Cole Mercer's face, the way the smile didn't reach the eyes, the way the shoulders stayed ready. Ethan spoke evenly. "No dog here." It was a lie, but it was a lie that bought time. Mercer's gaze flicked fast toward the floor behind Ethan like his nose could see through walls. "We're not here to cause trouble," Mercer said, still friendly. "If you have him, you're doing the right thing by keeping him warm. Let us take it from here." Ethan's jaw tightened at the word "it." Ranger growled behind him, and Mercer's smile faltered for half a beat. Ethan leaned closer to the crack in the door, voice dropping into something colder. "You come back with a warrant," Ethan said. "Or you don't come back." Mercer held up both hands in a gesture of peace, but his eyes sharpened. "All right," he said softly. No need to escalate. We'll check with local authorities. Ethan almost laughed. Local authorities. Up here, the nearest deputy was 40 minutes away on a good day, and Mercer knew it. Mercer backed down the porch steps, still smiling as if they'd just negotiated a polite misunderstanding. But before he turned away, his gaze landed on Ethan's face again, measuring, remembering. If the dog shows up, Mercer called, do the right thing. Then he walked back to the SUV with the easy confidence of a man who believed the story would end the way he wanted. The engine started. The SUVs rolled out, leaving only tire tracks and the fading stink of exhaust. Ethan shut the door and slid the bolt home, heart thumping with a familiar rhythm he hated pre-contact anticipation. Ranger limped closer, pressing his head against Ethan's thigh, not for comfort, but like he was making a vow. Ethan looked down at the dog and felt the cold truth settle into his bones. This wasn't a random rescue. This was a retrieval. And Ethan had just told the wrong people no. The night didn't return to quiet after the SUVs left. It only pretended to. Snow kept falling like a slow disguise, burying tire tracks in white innocence. But Ethan Cross could still feel the shape of the threat in the air, like smoke you couldn't see and couldn't ignore. Inside the cabin, the stove ticked with heat, and Ranger paced in short, stiff loops despite his splinted legs, stopping every few seconds to stare at the same window as if the glass was a map and the darkness outside was a coded message. Ethan watched him and felt that old Navy SEAL irritation, half respect, half worry, because the dog wasn't acting like a stray that had lucked into shelter. Ranger was acting like a soldier who had seen the enemy and was counting minutes until the next push. Ethan checked the locks twice, then once more for the lie of comfort, and finally sat at the rough kitchen table with a headlamp strapped on the beam, cutting a bright circle in the dim cabin. "All right," he murmured, voice low. "Let's figure out why they want you." Ranger stopped pacing and sat, chest forward, ears angled, eyes amber and unblinking. The dog's face was classic shepherd strong muzzle, intelligent brow, dark mask that made his expression look permanently serious, but there was a weariness around the eyes that came from more than hunger. Ethan slid closer on his knees and parted the fur at Ranger's neck, right where a battered collar had rubbed the skin raw. Ranger tensed lips, lifting just enough to show teeth, a reflex warning, but he didn't strike. Ethan's hands were careful, steady, and he kept talking like a metronome. "Easy. I'm not taking anything from you." Under the fur, Ethan found a tiny lump hard as a grain of rice, a microchip. But it wasn't in the usual veterinary location. It was placed with precision, deeper reinforced military neat. Ethan's jaw tightened. He'd seen tech like this before on gear that belonged to units that didn't exist on paper. He disinfected a small blade, made a minimal incision, and eased the chip out with tweezers. Ranger let out a short breath that sounded like anger forced into silence, then pressed his head briefly against Ethan's shoulder. Not affectionate, more like a message. "Do what you have to do." Ethan stared at the chip in his palm. Black casing, tiny etched code, no commercial branding. He felt the cold crawl up his spine. "Working dog," he whispered, tasting Cole Mercer's phrase again. "Yeah, but not the kind you put on posters." Ethan didn't have internet in the cabin by design. No notifications, no doom scrolling, no easy ways for bad memories to find him. But he had a satellite phone for emergencies, a stubborn relic he kept charged because survival still felt like responsibility. He dialed the only person he trusted with questions like this, Dr. Mason Reed. Mason picked up on the second ring, voice sleepy but alert in the way of men who never fully relax. Mason was 41, American, tall and long-limbed, with sandy blonde hair that always looked slightly uncombed and a neatly trimmed beard that made him seem gentler than he was. In another life, he might have looked like a college professor. In this one, he was a veterinarian with hands that didn't shake a former K-9 handler who had learned to stitch flesh and lie to bureaucracy in the same afternoon. "Ethan," Mason said, tone sharpening. "It's late. Talk to me." Ethan described the chip, read the etched code, and listened as Mason's silence stretched thin. "That format," Mason finally said, voice low. "That's not civilian. That's private contract military. And Ethan, those retrieval guys, they're not animal control. They're a leash with teeth." Ethan rubbed his thumb over the chip like he could erase what it meant. "You can decode it." "Not cleanly," Mason replied, "but I can try. I've seen similar tags from a program that got buried after a scandal fight rings illegal trials, rich men betting on dogs like their roulette. It's sick." Mason paused, then added softer. "If they came up your mountain in 3 SUVs, they're confident. That means Ranger is valuable." Ethan glanced at Ranger. The dog's ears twitched at his name as if he understood the word valuable the way a hunted thing understands the word trap. "I'm bringing him to you," Ethan said. "Tomorrow." Mason exhaled. "Ethan, you're in the woods. If they wanted him, they can come back with more. You need to move smart." "I know," Ethan said, and hated how familiar the sentence felt. After the call, Ethan packed with the efficiency of a man who had lived out of bags for years. He didn't take much first aid kit, water, jerky, extra bandages, the rifle, and the chip sealed in a plastic bag. He fashioned a sling from a blanket so Ranger could keep weight off the leg during the walk. Ranger resisted at first, pried again, then allowed it, stepping into the harness with reluctant compliance. The dog's coat had begun to dry, revealing a richer tan along the legs and a deep black saddle across the back, but the scars were clearer now, too, faint rope burns around the chest, tiny puncture marks near the ribs. Ethan's stomach turned. No stray earned those on accident. Just before dawn, Ethan heard it again. Tires. Not close like last time, but distant, crawling along the main road. Ranger stiffened, head snapping toward the sound. Ethan killed the stove, doused the embers, and let the cabin go cold. He didn't like leaving it, but he liked being found less. He stepped outside into the brittle morning stars fading the forest, holding its breath. They moved off the trail, cutting through the trees, using the terrain the way Ethan had used. Cities avoid lines, avoid habits, avoid predictability. Ranger limped but didn't falter. Eyes scanning, nose working, as if he was not just following Ethan, he was guiding him away from something. Half a mile from the cabin, Ranger stopped abruptly and began to dig at a patch of wind-packed snow near a fallen log. Ethan crouched, confusion flashing. "What is it?" Ranger dug harder, pawing with urgent intensity, until something dark appeared under the white. Ethan's fingers closed around it, a torn nylon strap, then a piece of canvas, then the corner of a weatherproof backpack, half frozen into the ground. Inside was a cracked phone, a stained notebook, and an ID badge with a photo of a clean-cut man in a hard hat, Noah Bennett, security engineer. Ethan flipped the notebook open and found one line written shaky but legible: "Don't trust Mercer." Ethan stared at the words until they burned into him. The forest suddenly felt smaller, closer, like the trees had leaned in to listen. Ethan looked at Ranger, and Ranger looked back with that same steady seriousness, like a confession made without sound. Ethan understood, then Ranger hadn't just run from danger. Ranger had carried evidence like a messenger that couldn't speak, but refused to forget. Ethan tucked the notebook into his jacket jaw, set heart heavier and strangely clearer. He had wanted a quiet winter to disappear in. Instead, the winter had handed him a mission. And as the sky lightened over Montana, Ethan Cross and the German Shepherd at his side moved deeper into the trees, leaving the cabin behind and walking straight toward the truth that someone had tried to bury. The morning light in the Montana timberline was thin and pale, more suggestion than warmth, and Ethan Cross felt it on his face like a hand that didn't quite know whether to comfort him or warn him. He moved with Ranger through the trees in steady, disciplined bursts, avoiding open ground, stepping around frozen branches that would snap loud enough to betray them. Ranger's splinted legs slowed him, but the German Shepherd's will made up the difference. He carried himself with stubborn dignity, ears always rotating toward distant sound, amber eyes scanning as if the forest was a living perimeter he had sworn to defend. Ethan kept the cracked phone and the notebook from Noah Bennett's buried backpack tucked inside his jacket, pressed close to his ribs like a second heartbeat. "Don't trust Mercer." The words repeated in his mind, not as advice, but as a directive. By mid-morning, they reached a narrow dirt road where the snow had been churned into gray slush by passing tires. Ethan crouched, studied the tracks, and felt his stomach tighten. Heavy tread. Multiple vehicles. Recent. Ranger sniffed the ground and gave a low, frustrated huff, then limped closer to Ethan as if to say, "We're late." Ethan didn't answer out loud. He just touched Ranger's shoulder, a brief grounding contact. "We keep moving," he whispered, voice rough with cold, and something else, purpose returning, unwanted, but undeniable. A mile later, they heard an engine and saw a county truck crawling along the road, tires squealing softly on ice. Ethan stepped out from the trees, raising both hands in a calm, non-threatening gesture. The truck stopped with a cautious roll, and a woman leaned across the steering wheel to look at him. She was in her early 30s, American, with wind-chapped fair skin and auburn hair pulled into a tight, practical braid under a green beanie. Her eyes were sharp hazel, the kind that noticed details first and made judgments second. She wore a sheriff's department jacket that looked like it had survived more than one winter, and her posture had the guarded confidence of someone who had learned that kindness didn't mean carelessness. "You lost," she called, voice carrying. Ethan gave her a polite nod. "Not lost," he said. "Need help." Ranger stepped into view beside him, and the deputy's expression changed instantly. Concern first, then suspicion, then professional control. She climbed out, boots crunching, and Ethan noticed a small scar above her left eyebrow, pale against freckled skin like an old lesson she'd paid for. Her name patch read, Deputy Kara Holt. Kara Holt looked at Ranger's splint and the blood-stained bandage and let out a slow breath. "That dog's been through it," she said. "You do that, I did the splint," Ethan replied. "Found him in a snare." Kara's jaw tightened at the word snare, anger flashing quick and hot. "Illegal as hell," she muttered. Then her gaze flicked to Ethan's face, measuring him the controlled stillness. The careful words, the eyes that didn't wander. "What's your name, Ethan Cross?" "You local seasonal," he said, which was the closest he could get to the truth without spilling everything. Kara crouched, extending a cautious hand toward Ranger's muzzle. Ranger didn't snap, but he didn't soften either. He stared at her with a soldier's stillness. Kara raised her eyebrows slightly. "He's trained?" she said, more observation than question. Ethan felt his muscles tense. Maybe he answered. "He's being hunted." Kara stood up slowly. By who, Ethan considered how much to say. He held up the notebook from Noah's backpack and showed her the line. Kara read it, her expression tightening. "Mercer," she repeated. "Cole Mercer." Ethan watched the flicker of recognition in her face and knew he'd stepped into something that already had roots here. Kara rubbed her thumb along her radio like she was deciding whether to call for backup or pretend she hadn't seen anything. "You don't want to throw names around without proof," she said quietly. The way she said it wasn't a warning to Ethan. It was a warning to herself. Ethan's voice stayed level. "I've got more than names," he said, and he pulled out the ID badge from the backpack. "Noah Bennett." Kara's eyes narrowed. "That guy's been missing," she said, and her tone shifted into something heavier. "Worked security up at Black Ridge Mine. Went off the grid 3 weeks ago. His wife's been raising hell at the station." Ethan felt a cold line draw itself through his chest. Missing wasn't a word. It was a grave with paperwork. Ranger let out a low growl at the mention of the mine, like the word tasted bad. Kara noticed. "You're headed somewhere?" she asked. Ethan nodded. "Bozeman?" he said, then corrected, "a vet. Mason Reed. He can help decode a chip." Kara's eyes sharpened. Chip Ethan didn't hand it over, but he showed the sealed bag. Kara exhaled, and for a moment she looked younger, like someone who wanted to do the right thing, and had learned how often the right thing got punished. "If Mercer's involved," she said, "you don't want to drive into town with those guys on your tail." Ethan's mouth twitched. "I wasn't planning to drive," he said. Kara's lips almost curved a flicker of humor in the cold. "All right, Seal," she said, and Ethan's eyes snapped to hers. He hadn't told her that. Kara shrugged as if it was obvious. "Your posture gives it away," she said. "Plus the way you look at my hands before my face. Soldiers do that." There was no judgment in her voice, only a blunt respect. Ethan felt something loosen in his chest. Not comfort, but recognition. Another person who saw the world as risk and still chose to show up. Kara turned and opened the back door of her truck. "Get the dog in," she said. "I'll take you part way. There's a turnout near the old logging road. Fewer cameras, fewer eyes." Ethan hesitated. Trust was a blade. But Ranger stepped forward first, limping toward the truck as if he'd already decided. Ethan followed, helping him climb in carefully. Kara drove with both hands on the wheel, eyes scanning mirrors, radio kept low. She didn't talk much, but when she did, her words were precise. "Mercer runs a private recovery outfit," she said. "They claim they retrieve stolen property. Sometimes animals, sometimes people don't ask too many questions because Mercer pays for community programs." Her jaw tightened. "I've never liked him." Ethan stared out at the snowbanks flashing by, feeling the story sharpen. "Noah Bennett," he said. "Did he have enemies?" Kara's mouth flattened. "He had a conscience," she replied. "That's enough." When they reached the turnout, Kara stopped and killed the engine. Silence settled like frost. She turned to Ethan, hazel, eyes steady. "Listen," she said. "I can't officially escort you without paperwork, and if Mercer's got friends in the county offices, my badge won't protect you. But she reached into her glove compartment and pulled out a small business card. On it was a name and a number handwritten beneath Lena Bennett. Noah's wife, Kara, said, "She's stubborn. She's loud. She won't be scared off. If you have anything that belongs to Noah, she deserves to know." Ethan took the card and felt the weight of it like a pledge. Kara glanced toward the road, then back at him. "And Cross, yeah, if you're wrong about Mercer, you'll look like a paranoid guy hiding a dog." Her eyes hardened. "But if you're right, you're standing in front of something ugly." Ethan's answer came without hesitation. "I've stood in front of ugly before," he said. Ranger let out a short huff from the back seat, almost like agreement. Kara opened the door. "Then, don't do it alone," she said. She helped Ethan get Ranger out, careful with the leg, and watched them disappear into the trees. As Ethan and Ranger moved down the logging road toward Bozeman and Mason Reed, Ethan felt the strange, mythic shift of fate the moment a lone man becomes part of a larger story. Somewhere behind them, Cole Mercer's tires would find the same slush, and somewhere ahead, Noah Bennett's wife would be waiting with grief sharpened into determination. The snow kept falling patient as Destiny and Ethan realized the forest wasn't just hiding them anymore. It was guiding them toward the war they hadn't chosen but could no longer avoid. Bozeman greeted them with late afternoon sun that looked like honey poured over ice, softening the edges of the mountains without pretending the cold had gone away. Ethan Cross kept to back streets and quiet lots, moving like a man who had spent years learning that crowds were just another kind of terrain. Ranger rode in the back seat of an old borrowed truck Kara had quietly arranged at the turnout. Nothing official, nothing traceable, lying on a blanket with his splinted legs stretched out, eyes half closed but ears still working. In daylight, the German Shepherd looked less like a stray and more like a disciplined survivor, thick black saddle along his back, rich tan legs, a torn notch in one ear, and the steady amber gaze of an animal that didn't waste loyalty on the undeserving. Ethan parked behind a low, gray building with a faded sign, Reed Veterinary and K9 Rehab. The place smelled faintly of disinfectant dog shampoo and coffee that had lived too long on a hot plate. Doctor. Mason Reed met them at the back door as if he'd been waiting on a timer. Mason was tall, lanky, and sun-worn, his sandy hair messy in a permanent state of, "I stopped caring at 4 a.m. His beard was neatly trimmed, but his eyes were the giveaway, blue-gray alert, tired in the way of men who carry too many stories for one lifetime. He didn't ask for small talk. He looked at Ranger's leg, then at Ethan's face. "You look like you haven't slept in a week," Mason said. "I've slept," Ethan replied. "Just not all at once." Mason's mouth twitched. "Yeah, I remember." He guided them into a treatment room lined with stainless tables and shelves stacked with wrap splints and K9 harnesses. Ranger tried to stand, pride surging, but Mason raised a hand, calm and confident. "Easy, big guy," he said, voice gentle. Ranger studied him, then huffed and allowed Mason to examine the bandage. Mason's hands were precise and warm, the hands of someone who had earned an animal's trust by respecting pain. "Field work," Mason murmured, checking the splint. "Not bad. You did the wrap right. But he needs antibiotics and a better brace." Ethan exhaled through his nose, the smallest release. It felt stupidly good to hear "not bad" from someone who actually meant it. Mason injected medication, reset the brace with practiced speed, and then looked at the plastic bag Ethan placed on the counter, the chip. Mason's expression hardened as he set a reader against it. A string of code appeared that didn't look like any civilian registry. "Private contract," Mason said grimly. "Encrypted. But the signature... I've seen this." He pulled up an old folder on his computer, a file buried under layers of digital dust. 3 years ago, he said, a program got shut down after whistleblower rumors. Dogs used as assets for security trials, illegal fight conditioning, experimental protocols. Rich men and corrupt contractors, the kind of evil that wears a tie. Ethan's jaw tightened. "Mercer," he said. Mason nodded. Cole Mercer was listed as a subcontractor in one of the civil filings. Ethan felt the pieces click into place like a bolt locking home. Ranger wasn't just wanted. Ranger was evidence. Mason leaned closer, lowering his voice. "If Mercer's chasing him, Mercer's scared. That's good. Scared men make mistakes." Ethan pulled out Noah Bennett's notebook and the ID badge. Mason's face went still. "Noah," he said quietly, as if the name had weight. "I met him once. He brought a Malinois in for a suspicious injury that didn't match the story. He looked like a man trying to stay alive by pretending he wasn't afraid. Ethan watched Mason's eyes darken with anger. "Can you find his wife?" Ethan asked. Mason pointed at the business card Kara had given him. "Lena Bennett." Ethan nodded. "We tell her." An hour later, Lena arrived with the kind of speed only grief can fuel. She was in her early 30s, American with olive-toned skin and dark brown hair pulled into a messy bun that looked like it had been yanked into place without a mirror. She wore a winter coat over jeans and boots dusted with salt, and her face had the sharp, exhausted beauty of someone who hadn't cried in public because she was too busy fighting. Her eyes were deep green and rimmed red, but the gaze inside them was fierce, like she'd decided the world didn't get to take anything else from her without a fight. She stepped into the room and stopped when she saw Noah's ID badge in Ethan's hand. Her breath hitched, and for a heartbeat she looked like she might shatter. Then she straightened. "Where did you get that?" she demanded, voice trembling but hard. Ethan explained in clean, careful sentences the buried backpack, the note, the men in SUVs, the chip, the name Mercer. Lena listened without interrupting, jaw clenched so tight a muscle jumped near her cheekbone. When Ethan finished, she looked at Ranger. Ranger lifted his head and met her eyes. The dog's tail didn't wag. He didn't perform. He simply stared at her with a steady seriousness that said, "I remember him." Lena's hand flew to her mouth. That's Noah's dog," she whispered. "He called him Ranger. He used to come home smelling like pine and snow, and he'd complain about the shedding, but he loved that dog like family." She dropped to her knees, hands hovering as if afraid to touch. Ranger leaned forward and pressed his forehead gently to hers, a slow, deliberate contact. Lena let out a sound that was half sob, half laugh, relief mixed with heartbreak like sunlight breaking through a storm. Mason cleared his throat, glancing away to give her dignity. Ethan felt his own chest tighten, the strange ache of witnessing a reunion he hadn't known he needed to see. Then the phone on Mason's desk buzzed. A message from Kara Holt. Mercer's vehicles spotted near Black Ridge turnoff. Moving fast. Ethan's body went cold and calm at the same time. He looked at Mason. Mason looked back. No words needed. Mason opened a drawer and slid a small external drive across the table. "I cracked part of the chip," Mason said. "Not everything, but enough. It points to a storage unit rented under Mercer's company name, and it logs GPS pings routes. One route repeats." Ethan tapped the map. "Black Ridge Mine," he said. Lena's eyes flashed. "That's where Noah worked," she whispered. Ethan nodded. "And where Mercer doesn't want anyone looking." Mason's voice sharpened. "We do this right. We don't play lone hero." Ethan glanced at Lena. "You don't have to come," he said. Lena stood up, wiping her face with the heel of her hand, and the grief in her eyes turned into steel. "That man stole my husband," she said. "I'm done being polite about it." Ranger pushed himself upright, limping but determined, and stood beside her like a guardian statue. Ethan felt something warm stir under the ice inside him, hope dangerous and bright. They weren't alone anymore. Kara had eyes on the road. Mason had the data. Lena had the truth. Ranger had the memory. Ethan had the skills he thought he'd buried with his old life. As the sun sank over Bozeman, turning the snow pink and gold, Ethan realized this was what healing looked like sometimes. Not quiet, not soft, but shared. He reached down and scratched Ranger behind the ear, right where the notch made him look permanently battle-worn. Ranger huffed, and for the first time his tail gave one small thump against the floor, like a yes. Ethan allowed himself a small, rare smile. "All right," he murmured. "Let's bring him home." And outside, the winter wind moved through the pines as if it were finally making room for spring. When Ethan Cross found Ranger in that snare, it didn't look like a miracle. It looked like mudblood and a broken leg in a cold world that didn't care. But sometimes God doesn't send thunder or angels. Sometimes he sends a tired man with steady hands and a wounded dog who refuses to give up. Sometimes the miracle is simply this one brave choice made on an ordinary day becomes the door God uses to bring someone home. If you're watching this and life has been heavy, if you've felt forgotten, rejected, or trapped by something you didn't choose, remember that God can still write redemption into the snow. He can turn pain into purpose and loss into a path that leads to love, healing, and new beginnings. And in daily life, it might look small, checking on a neighbor, feeding a stray, forgiving one more time, holding on one more night. Those little acts of mercy are how miracles often arrive quietly, faithfully, right when we think it's too late. If this story touched your heart, please share it with someone who needs hope today. Drop a comment below and tell us, have you ever experienced a miracle in disguise or a moment you believe God placed someone in your path? And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss a new story of courage, love, and second chances. May God bless you and your family, protect you on every road you travel, and fill your home with peace today and always. Amen.